The quality of education today in our schools is generally extremely high. So why is it that teachers aren't getting the credit for their quality of teaching sometimes? Well, that's because there's another factor, and that is the ability of the children to take in that information. And that's a neurological thing. Sometimes, of course, it's choice, but more often than not, it's neurological. Taking in information when we listen, taking in information as we look at things and observe, or taking in information by reading, they are all skills. If they're highly developed, taking in information and processing it will be effortless. If those skills are not fully developed, then it doesn't matter how good the teacher is, that information isn't going to go in and be processed and retained. So what's going on neurologically? Well, let's take listening. Listening is a skill which, when fully developed, is effortless. There's no thought required. The sound waves that go into the ears automatically get comprehended into thoughts, to concepts. They understand. That's when it's fully developed. But for those children that don't have fully developed listening skills, they need an extra thought process to turn those sound waves into comprehended thoughts. And that's a process that takes place here in the prefrontal cortex. So fully developed listening all gets processed up here, effortless, instantaneous, wonderful, not even tiring. But when you have an auditory processing deficit, a limitation to that development of that skill, the skills hit a glass ceiling if you like, then there's an extra thought process. You have to think about what you're hearing to turn it into concepts you understand. And when teacher is talking, that child, after 2 or 3 sentences, will be still processing the first sentence and will be losing his place. Not a surprise. And it's not a choice of the child. And it's not because the child necessarily is unintelligent. It's simply that the skill of taking in information by listening isn't fully developed. Sometimes we call it ADD or ADHD. Sometimes there's no diagnosis. It's just that child is slow. Well, the processing speed when they have to think about what's being said, the processing speed is about 100,000 times slower. Yes, 100,000 times slower than if they can process it fully, effortlessly, automatically and naturally. So it's very important to understand that many children struggle with listening for reasons outside of their control, outside of everybody's control. And it's incredibly hard for them. So a child that has an incomplete listening processing skill is going to be working thousands of times harder than the children that are natural at listening and taking in information. So we need to understand that and sympathize with them. The same is true of visual processing too. Visual processing is a skill. Some people are highly observant. You write something on the board and they've got it. It makes sense to them. But others, they can be looking at it for half an hour and it still isn't making sense. A third aspect and a particular subset of visual processing is reading. You know, those children that struggle with reading, often underneath they're very bright. But when you take a video and have a look at this, take a video of what happens when they try and read, you can see their eyes aren't smoothly going along the lines, they're jumping about. So when the information has gone in, they have to unscramble it. They have to turn it into letters and words that they can make sense of. So that's a skill that hasn't developed. Is it low intelligence? No. Is it laziness? No. Is it bad parenting or bad teaching? No. It's a skill that hasn't yet fully developed. Now, in the case of reading, I know it's been very fashionable for many years to give more phonics, and teachers have been encouraged to do that. Well, what I've observed is that teachers are very good at getting more than enough phonics instruction across by the age of 7. And some academics now believe that if you try and give more phonics after the age of 7, it hinders rather than helps. Because it's not phonics that's holding them back, it's the skill of eye movement. It's a fine motor skill, it's not precise, it's not fully developed, and that is what's holding them back. So take comfort from the fact you've probably taught all those children more than enough phonics. That isn't the issue. It's now a skill, a neurological development that's hit a glass ceiling and hasn't continued to be fine-tuned until it's fully automatized. So that in the vast majority of cases, in my experience having worked with tens of thousands of children that struggle with reading, after the age of 7, it's incredibly rare for it to be more phonics that they need. And in fact, academics are now saying that can be dangerous to give them more phonics. And one described it like keeping stabilizers or training wheels on a bike after they can ride properly. It kind of holds them back from the next stage of development. So just remember, children that struggle with reading, very often it's not low intelligence. So when you've got any skills that you need a lot, like listening, reading, visual skills, or even balance and coordination, or social skills, verbalization skills, all of these are skills, and if any of those are impaired, then it means that there's an awful lot of thought process needed by that child to be able to function. And where does that thought process take place? Here in the prefrontal cortex. Fully developed skills up here, 100,000 times faster, infinite capacity. When you've got a learning impairment, a learning difficulty if you like, an awful lot of processing is taking place here, where you've got a maximum capacity of 7 typically, 7. So it's very easy to run out of space here, and it's 100,000 times slower than what's happening up here. So it's very, very easy to go into overload in your prefrontal cortex, in your thinking brain. So you'll notice that those children that struggle with learning, their executive functions are often impaired. And what are the executive functions? Well, things like attention, what they focus on. Their eyes can go anywhere. They can get easily distracted when they have an issue with auditory processing or visual processing or eye tracking or those skills that they need all the time. So the most common executive function that goes out of the window is attention, literally out of the window sometimes. And then there's control of emotions. Have you noticed that children that struggle with learning often display huge frustration? They're easily tearful or angry. They just lose it. Well, that says their thinking brain is full of stuff. Mainly stuff that need not be there, should not be there. But when this gets full, you run out of mental capacity. The executive function that controls your emotions just can't operate. There's not enough mental capacity there. It's busy doing other things. So impulsivity is another one of those things, and it's a common symptom. Memory functions. If this is your working memory space and it's full of helping you out with basic skills that haven't been fully developed, then guess what? Your memory is going to be worse, your short-term memory. And if your short-term memory is worse, you've got nowhere to store things so that it can be stored in long-term memory overnight. And so the retention is going to be very poor. So when you go into things like cognitive load, which is increasingly fashionable and it's awesome, really good stuff. Cognitive load I'm a big fan of. And all of the other things that teachers do to increase the ability of the child to take information in the classroom. Please remember that alongside everything you do, and in the main do it brilliantly, is also that child's own ability, or lack of ability as the case may be, to take in information easily, effortlessly process it so that it can be retained. Are there things you can do? Yep, you need to understand what's happening in the brain, particularly in the cerebellum. That's the bit at the back here. It's the junction box between brain and all of the organs of the body. And if that's not fully developed, then skills often hit a glass ceiling. So I hope this is useful to you, and I hope you realise you're actually achieving far more than you're getting the credit for right now. And that, equally as importantly, it's not the child's fault. Just in the same way it's not your fault. If they've got a skill that's underdeveloped, let's see if we can analyse that. Let's see if we can find the root cause and see if there's some way of helping that development continue to break through the glass ceiling so you can see their real intelligence and everyone can see how effective you has been at teaching. Wish you all the best.